Hello and welcome to the Legal Thinking podcast with me, Ed Wootton, and my, I'm afraid, soon-to-be ex-co-host, Liam Pape. I've got some bad news, Liam.
You're getting rid of me?
Yeah,
this is a disgrace.
I have some terrible news. You know that meeting you had the other day with that robot person?
Excellent improv skills here, Ed. Yes, I remember that meeting.
Well, they've done some assessment and you're done. No more podcast hosting for you.
You mean to say that I'm getting sacked because of an AI?
That is correct.
This is excellent audio acting going on here as well.
That is correct. And I have no idea how it works, but I'm afraid that's just the way it is.
Well, actually, Ed, I might not be sacked because I had a great conversation with Selby and Benefer about the ins and outs of AI when it comes to HR and employment. Roll tape. So Carl, just to start off, can you give us a brief overview of what are some of the ways AI can be used by employers and HR teams?
Yeah, sure. So AI can be used in the employment, both recruitment process, so looking and scanning CVs and doing things like video interviews, through to the dismissal process potentially, or performance reviews during the employee's employment. So the case that we're coming on to look at will talk about a redundancy process where AI was used to film interviews with the people who are being made redundant, and looking at the way that could be their performance in that interview could be assessed by AI rather than by humans.
I think the most common use of AI in employment context is in the recruitment side of things, with filtering out CVs that don't meet minimum criteria, but it can be used throughout any part of the employment relationship. For example, monitoring performance, productivity, training is often done via AI rather than in person now. Any part of the relationship. I think the idea of using it for dismissals and the end of the relationship is far more rare, but obviously this case perhaps changes that.
Yes, I guess they've started to develop these tools primarily for the initial process of taking people on, where you've got a lot of data that you want to process. So, you get 100 CVs for a job rather than having someone that sorts through those. You get an AI tool to give each one a score, and then you can narrow them down from there to avoid, people spending too much time doing that review.
Excellent. That sounds perfect. So what could possibly go wrong?
Everything. I think the main thing that can go wrong is what's happened here is it's just a lack of transparency as to what's actually happening behind the scenes. So the Estee Lauder case that was sort of the focus of this discussion involved 3 individuals who were placed at risk of redundancy and then were dismissed and found redundant as a result of, or partly of, a video interview that AI made a decision on and decided on the basis of the answers that they gave and the expressions on their face during that videoed interview that they were not successful for the remaining roles in the business. And because it was done by a computer system, there isn't then the ability to challenge that decision or have transparency over the reasons behind the decision that's been made. It's all technology that's determined it. So the individuals in question in this case tried to challenge it and weren't given satisfactory answers by the organisation, because the organisation would just point to the AI and didn't have an individual that could give a statement or an explanation verbally about what had happened. And the result was that the company ended up settling with these individuals to avoid an ongoing dispute. So there's a transparency issue and a fairness perspective from an employment angle. But there are also data protection issues that could easily play a part. Under data protection law in the UK, there's a requirement to be transparent and to tell individuals what data is going to be processed about them and how that processing will take place. And there's a real danger that those policies have been drafted before AI has been introduced, and that companies then get carried away, introduce new AI for processes and don't update their privacy policy to tell employees or other individuals that they're going to use this technology, which then puts them in breach of data protection law. Also, from a data protection perspective, there's a requirement to tell people if there is going to be any automated decision making. That's a specific requirement, needs to be covered off. And lots of businesses that I've dealt with will have simply said there is not going to be any automated decision making because that was the norm at the time. Obviously, as AI improves and more programs are available to use for an employment relationship, employers need to remember to put that into their policies to say that those decisions will be made in that way. Otherwise, they will be in breach.
So, Kate, you mentioned earlier that it's more rare for AI to be used for dismissal. And by the sounds of this, it's maybe not the best idea to use it for dismissal at all. So is it right to use AI for these decisions?
Personally, I would say there are probably more risks than it's worth. More risks than benefits in using it for dismissal, certainly at this point in time. I think, as Carl mentioned earlier, when you're looking at a mass load of candidates that you need to filter through, and there's a huge time issue, I can understand the justification for using AI to improve that. But for most dismissals, you're likely to be looking at a very small number of people. And those individuals already have rights generally within the business. So to then put their future employment based purely on an AI decision, I think it is risky. I think companies will find themselves in difficulty in defending claims because they don't have the process or the explanation as to what decisions have been made. So to say something is fair when it's based on a computer program, I think is going to be more difficult. There's also always a risk that there's bias built into AI, either by the initial programming or by the way that the AI has developed over time, which could lead to discrimination arguments, for example, from individuals who say that the AI particularly disadvantages people with particular characteristics. And if it's the decision made by a human, that human can provide an explanation and go on a witness stand and say that it wasn't discriminatory. But when it's AI, it's much more difficult to do that. So my view is that there are a lot of risks, and it's probably safer to save AI for the less contentious areas of an employment relationship.
Yeah. And I was going to say, and just from that sort of purely technical or technological point of view, the AI will develop its decision making as it goes along. So, part of what it's doing is machine learning. It's taking the data sets that it has and improving its decision making processes to get to the outcome it's been told to get to by using that information. But it doesn't necessarily articulate the decision-making process that it's going through to do that. So it can't necessarily give you the output of, this is how we used this is how the system used the data it's been given to make that decision. So looking at the facial recognition that was used here, it would know what it was looking for, but it wouldn't be able to tell you what it was looking for necessarily. Someone would have to do a quite sizable bit of work to work out how it had developed that process. And I think that's, again, possibly where employers will face a challenge, Kate, because if they faced a claim, they would have to be able to tell people how that decision had been reached. And actually, the platform might not want to tell you because it's their sort of trade secret that they want to keep away from their competitors. And also, they just might not be able to do that, or would not want to put the resource into getting to that decision. And you as an employer have to be able to stand up and, as you say, give some evidence about the way in which that decision was reached. And just saying the platform did it isn't good enough.
Absolutely not. So you're saying that this potentially leaves employers and HR managers in quite a sticky situation. So if in the case of the Estee Lauder case we were talking about, and other employers who use AI for hiring and dismissal, are these systems becoming more transparent? Is there a way that they can put in their contracts when they go to tender clauses about needing transparency so they can justify these decisions? And is there any appetite by the people who make these systems to have more?
I think, as Carl said, some of the difficulty with transparency is sort of protecting the AI design in itself, and the manufacturers are not going to want to be too clear as to how their AI works, as that reveals the secrets that make the AI have value and be able to sell it. Otherwise, their competitors become aware of exactly what makes up that particular AI software. I think the other difficulty with transparency is I don't know how possible that's always going to be, because as Carl mentioned, the system will learn over time from the amount of data that goes in, and to be able to extract exactly what it's learned and how it's interpreting everything, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be possible to the extent that an individual would expect when seeking an explanation about why they've lost their job, or why they're being disciplined, or why some other negative treatment is happening to them.
Yeah, and from a sort of contractual point of view, if you were the platform provider, you would want to make sure that the algorithm that you're using, the AI code, etc., that's being used is a confidential information and won't be passed on to third parties, which may well include claimants in case cases brought against the employer. But also, you'd probably want to limit your liability to the decisions that the AI is making, and saying, essentially, we're not responsible for the decisions it's making, which is kind of counterintuitive, given that's exactly what they're selling it for. But from a contractual point of view, that's the type of limitations that they will try to impose in the contract. And until someone picks them up on it and pushes that point hard in negotiations, as you say, as part of a tender process or otherwise, I suspect the platform providers will try and stick to that line to make it as hard as possible for people to bring claims against the platforms, and basically leave the risk with the employer.
So maybe this is a little bit out of the remit of what we were going to talk about. But from a regulatory point of view, is there any appetite that you've seen from lawmakers on making these platforms a little more transparent when they're using AI? So again, to give a recent example, in the post office scandal recently, for the last decade or so, workers were dismissed because at the end of every day, the computer was saying that these managers of local post offices had been stealing money when they hadn't been. And Fujitsu, who made the systems, obviously argued at the time that they can't reveal kind of the process or the algorithms that the computer's using because, as you say, Carl, they are competitive secrets. But for how long will companies be able to not necessarily hide behind this argument of we don't want to give away competitive secrets? So yeah, is there any appetite from a regulatory point of view? Are lawmakers interested in making this a little bit more transparent? Because there are quite a few cases now where there has been significant issues.
Yeah, I haven't heard any noise. I don't know if you have, Kate, about any upcoming legislations or even consultation on that particular point. I suspect if it becomes more widely used, you will end up in a position where someone will have to regulate it, much in the way that, cryptocurrency regulation is now taking up more and more prevalence as it becomes more widely used. But going back to the sort of post office scandal, part of the problem there not only was that Fujitsu didn't want to release the information about the errors within their code, and that was simpler because it was traditional computer coding that was being used. Someone could more easily analyze that to find the bugs, and in fact the bugs were well known within Fujitsu and indeed the post office. But there was an issue that not just the postmasters and others that were involved, but also their lawyers and the post office lawyers failing to understand the importance of analysing the outputs that the computer was making. They just assumed on a number of the cases that came up that the computer would be correct, and that's what caused a lot of the problems. And I suspect there's a risk that something similar would happen in this context, where the AI would be the crutch that people lean against to say, we followed this process and we use this platform, which is, very well regarded in the industry for making these decisions. And a lot of them are sold on the basis that they are less biased than a human would be, because you can, in theory, train a computer to be completely ambivalent to whatever characteristics that you want. You might otherwise bias against. But in reality, that depends entirely on what the computer's told to do in the first place, which is done by a human, and secondly, what it's then trained on. So you might end up with the opposite problem, that in fact it has different biases, but biases that apply in a way that's almost more discriminatory to people than a human would do, because they would, at least in their own head, rationalize the decision that they're making, which a computer wouldn't do at this stage in its development. I guess there's partly a cultural thing here, which people aren't very comfortable with computers making the decisions. It's the same thing with sort of self-driving cars. They might one day make the most fantastic self-driving car that is way safer than a normal car, but somehow, if you've been used to normal cars with humans driving them and someone to blame if there's an accident, you will still prefer the human driver to the AI driver, despite the fact the evidence suggests it's much safer. And the same will apply here, that there may be a point at which the decision-making from the AI is better than human decision-making and less biased, and you can demonstrate that through data, but people will still value the human decision over the computer decision.
I think people just like to deal with people, and I think people generally feel more comfortable if somebody,
of course,
even if it is slightly biased in some way, has explained a decision and has come up with it on the basis of personal interactions that are based on real life, rather than something that feels a little bit manufactured.
Yeah, it'd be like if I replaced my part on this podcast with a kind of emotional speech development tool that could come up with it for me. I think everyone will feel less comfortable with that than me talking, probably.
I was just going to say, I think people, especially when it comes down to emotional intelligence, would find it more difficult to trust an AI, just because unlike any kind of these intuition tests you can do as part of the interview process, emotional intelligence isn't something that is binary and that can be like a 1 or a 0. It is something where you're reading someone's face and body language and intonation, etc. There's
a documentary on the BBC about the Estee Lauder Mac case. And one of the things they picked up on was the fact that if you suffer from sort of autism or Asperger's syndrome or something like that, you will find it much more difficult to deal with an AI tool making decisions.
Of course,
just because of the different way in which you might perceive things. And I guess there's also a disability discrimination potential here for if you're using these tools and people have things like autism or other disabilities that may get prejudiced without anyone thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I mean, even things like anxiety, where people perhaps just feel less comfortable in a situation that isn't quite as natural as they're used to. Sometimes people can be made to feel more comfortable by sitting with someone like their manager who they know and can give more natural answers. Whereas if they're sat facing a computer, their behavior isn't necessarily reflective of how they would normally behave or the answers that they would normally be given. It just reflects a situation that they feel uncomfortable with, and that could be a higher risk for people with disabilities relating to mental illness.
Of course, yeah. So I think, Kate, you touched upon this point earlier, which is AI has bias. Humans making decisions also have bias, but the key difference is that humans are far more transparent. And you can go up to a human and say, so what's your thought process behind that? And that can be scrutinized and criticized, etc., etc.
Exactly. And also, a human is able to perhaps take a step back and sort of judge their own bias and say, have I been biased here? Is there any risk? And you can get a second opinion and a second human to look at things. And often with a redundancy process, for example, we would advise that more than one manager is involved in scoring or in a process so that you avoid or reduce the risk of any bias. And that just doesn't work as well with AI, which is obviously unable to properly explain itself. On the point that you just mentioned, I'm also not aware of any particular drive to regulate AI providers in any particular way. But I think even if that did happen, I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where an employer is able to fully excuse itself. I think if it's using AI, it still has a responsibility to interpret that AI and not just blindly go along with it. I don't think that will ever be an excuse, even if there is some further responsibility placed on the AI provider to disclose information or take some responsibility for what it's provided.
Yeah, depending on which flavour of government you've got in power at the time that this becomes a real issue, you might end up with it being the other way round, which is the onus is put more onto the employer to make sure that that decision-making process is done in a fair and transparent manner, I would have thought. So, yeah, it will depend on what the views of the legislators are at the time that the regulations come in. And I'm sure over the course of the next few decades, it will change over time.
Yeah. I mean, from an employment tribunal perspective, the tribunal is not going to care that much that the AI provider had, built-in bias or a glitch in its program. It's going to be looking at whether the employer acted in a reasonable way and did what it should do and complied with its own obligations. So it won't be an excuse to say, well, we just relied on something else that told us to do something and we didn't think about it. And also from the GDPR perspective that I mentioned earlier, that is a responsibility on the data controller, which in this case would be the employer, to be transparent, to provide the information, to tell individuals what is going to happen, what process is going to happen. And none of that comes down to the algorithm or the AI provider. It's all about the employer being, communicating with staff and informing them about what is happening in advance of it happening.
From the point of view of employers, there's not just the employment law aspects to think about. There's the data protection ones, including the need to do data protection impact assessments where people are using automated decision making. So they would need to be able to show that they've considered how the data is being processed, obviously had the sort of lawful basis for doing that as well, and that they were protecting the interests of the data subjects in processing the information through an automated AI platform. And if they failed to do that properly, I'm sure the ICO would take a fairly dim view, given the potential impact on the data subject of the way that this information would be processed. And the potential fines for doing that are up to £20 million or I'll do that again, up to £17.5 million or 4% of worldwide turnover, whichever is the higher. So potentially the regulatory impact could be very significant for employers on top of the employee having rights to bring claims against them.
So is there a reputational risk to employers who are using these AI systems?
Yeah, I mean, there's an internal risk. I think if using the case as an example, I suppose, with other staff finding out their colleagues have been sacked because of their facial expression that was judged by a computer, perhaps isn't the best impression.
I was going to say from an employee point of view, I think people can understand other people making decisions, and if they're having a conversation with them, they've got that chance to react in the way you would do in a normal conversation. Whereas if you're just talking to a computer screen and the camera, you're not as used to doing that without interaction from the other side. So actually, how good a judge is that process going to be of a process? It's a bit different with the CV, because the CV is kind of black and white, and you can put it in. Although I did hear a case, you can manipulate the CV software by putting in text in white. So you wouldn't read it on the CV, but the AI would look at it and give you a score based on it, which I thought was an interesting way of manipulating it. Although I suspect, Kate, you'll tell me that if you do that and get found out, it's probably a more serious consequence for the employee, given you're effectively trying to hide stuff or manipulate the system.
I think with cases like that, employers would be quite impressed. I think they'd see the niftiness what you're doing, and if anything, give you bonus points.
Depending on what industry you're in, I can imagine the SRA would take a very If you're a solicitor and you're trying to get a job by deceiving your employer, I think the SRA would take a very dim view, and you'd probably get struck off.
So you've both kind of naturally started going towards this point anyway. But my next question was just going to be: we've kind of poo-pooed AI a little bit and spoke about the negative cases where it's been it's fallen short of what it should be doing. However, it is inevitable that it is going to be used because, Carl, as you pointed out again right at the beginning, that if an employer is getting hundreds, if not thousands of CVs, they need an easy way of being able to sift through them. So we'll go to both of you, but what advice would you give to HR managers and employers who are using AI for hiring and dismissal?
I mean, my main advice would be that they have to think through why they're using it. What's the purpose, and can they justify the need to do so? So, as Carl mentioned about this sort of the impact assessment, it's thinking through what is the impact of using that technology and what's the potential repercussions of it. And if they're comfortable and can document that thought process, the next stage is the transparency point, to be absolutely clear with individuals that is what they're going to do, and then not rely on the AI solely. So if the AI makes a decision, to apply some sort of common sense and human input into reviewing that rather than just following the AI on its own.
So almost a bit of a hybrid system, which seems to be the word of the decade for this decade.
I would say so. I think it still needs a human check. Mm-hmm. I think just relying on AI on its own is not going to be enough. It's certainly not going to be enough to defend an employment claim. And I don't think it would help from a GDPR data protection perspective. So I think there still needs to be an element of human decision making.
Yeah.
And Carl, is there anything you'd add to that?
Well, no, I think Kate's covered the sort of key points. But with my geek hat on, I always think eventually the technology will become better at making decisions than humans, mainly because it will evolve and learn from its mistakes, or be told to learn from its mistakes. And humans are sort of notoriously not very good at doing that, and tend to have views that they want to, that are their core values, I suppose, or core beliefs that they have, that they then filter into the decision-making process, regardless of how hard they try not to. So I think in time, these sort of systems can be trained to do a better job than a human would be able to. But I think the technology is just not there yet. So until that happens, I think that hybrid model is the way forward. And also just to really interrogate how that platform is making decisions and get the suppliers who are making these claims about how good their system is and how it helps with things like diversity or inclusion and equality. Work out what they're doing, how they're doing it, and try and ask them as many questions as you can to understand the decision making that's going on behind the platform, so that you can then make a genuine assessment of the effectiveness of that tool, and also from a data protection point of view, be able to explain it to someone else, because ultimately that's what you've got to be able to do.
Okay, Liam, well, I suppose an apology is due. It sounds like it's not quite as simple or straightforward, so I guess I'll have to put up with you for a bit longer. Oh,
I see what we're doing. We're going back to what we were talking about in the intro with this improvised me getting sacked thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant to say good. Yes.
Well, yeah, if you want to find out more about the changing dimensions of work, you can visit royswithyking.com/changing-dimensions to have a look at our report into the future of work, which has got some fascinating contributors, hasn't it, Liam?
It has indeed. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to it and listen to previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts.